All right, hello. Welcome to the Antigen Security Cyber Forum. This is a more long form, almost like a podcast, but also with many more guests. Instead of just Stephen or I, we have brought all of our friends along for this wonderful adventure into the IT security landscape. We will have a variety of topics to talk about. Some of the more news noteworthy ones we'll kind of go round table, kind of discuss, but before we get into all that, we'll do introductions. For myself and Steven, we're from Antigen, so we'll skip right to our guests and start with Kirsten Bay. You're muted. You went right off.
Oh, sorry. I momentarily that evil mute button. I'm Kirsten Bay. I am the CEO and co-founder of Cysurance, embedded insurance products into security products, and delighted to be here.
Awesome. We'll go with Brian Schnelby. We did not go through last names before this, so I apologize. I'm one of those people that butcher names, so I apologize.
No, all good. Schneebly, actually. Some people would say Schnebla. If you've seen the movie School of Rock, they're like, Mr. Schneebly. So Brian Schneebly, Director of Cybersecurity at GTS. So happy to be here.
All right. And then we have Matt. I think Steven said this. McGonigal.
Hey, everybody. This is Matt McGonigal, currently with RetireCo. We specialize kind of in all signs of insurance and risk management, and continuing to get more involved with Steven and the antigen side of things here as well. So appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, with introductions out of the way, again, we'll have 4 different topics to go through. Again, we'll just kind of, it's going to be a round table, but it's a little bit, if you have something, just kind of speak up, raise your hand. And I'm just here to control the chaos and the time and to move the conversation along. So the first one we have is the MGM Hack. So I'll give a brief synopsis or what happened here. So on September 11th, MGM reported they were dealing with a cybersecurity issue. If you went to social media, you found that hotel room keys weren't working, slot machines, their main website, and then other hotel electronics. September 20th, it came out that everything was back to normal-ish. And then on October 5th, MGM announced that attackers had accessed the personal information for guests and hotel residents, names, contact information, gender, date of birth, driver's license, passport, social security numbers, dating back to March 2019. A group called Scattered Spider, which uses social engineering techniques, claimed responsibility for the hack and got in, pretending to be an employee that they had found on LinkedIn and then calling the IT help desk. Ransomware was, of course, deployed, which is why kind of we're all here at this point. And why we're still employed. But I don't know who wants to go first, but thoughts on just the MGM hack in general at this point.
Stephen, take it away. Give your thoughts jumping in, because everyone calls it a hack, and it is. But where did it begin, right? And most people think of a bunch of people in hoodies breaking into computers, but this started really with social engineering. And I think that's what makes this one really interesting, of how they were able to gain access, and that then from there, the foothold in terms of the forensics and everything they did to discover how far and wide they got. But that initial point breach happened through social engineering. So, Stephen, love to hear your take on, because I think it expounds on when people start to talk about AI and how that could be used. Could AI be a better salesperson than you joining a call 2 years from now, selling somebody's product or having a discussion to get somebody to give them information?
It certainly could be, and is being used by the threat actor groups that are doing a lot of business email compromise and other forms of social engineering. But that is, Brian, to your point, I think what's most interesting about this, because it really, apart from all the common conversations about controls, frameworks, and really everything that becomes relevant from a cybersecurity underwriting and claims perspective, but that social element really was the gap in the armor that allowed this all to play out. And given it was, an internal staff member with access to a lot of those systems that they targeted, there's not really a better use case for the need for a organizationally and risk aligned security awareness program to address this kind of proactively moving forward, especially for folks with that heightened level of access and the ability to be targeted in the same way. I think as a narrative or an overall arc that you could see play out in other environments in the future, this is really just one of many of these types of examples that we've seen in recent times, and represents, to your point, Brian, with the advent of generative AI, some real concerns about how this could be weaponized and taken to scale further than just a handful of affiliates with specific ransomware gangs.
And to follow along with that, because there's another element of this, which is around business mission and the dissonance sometimes between security posture and implementation and business mission, because it's important to remember that internal IT support is still considered customer support, but it's just internal customers. And that those organizations, those people within that organization, their performance reviews are actually based on time to resolution of an internal call. And so they're trying to be helpful without realizing that they're being compromised. And so how do we get that alignment between business mission and the importance of being secure when my job in this instance, if I'm that person, is to get resolution quickly and to help that person get back up and running? And so certainly security awareness training is a key component of this, but oftentimes when we're looking at those security implementations, the question isn't asked, well, how are you being measured, person who needs to be secure and ask the right questions, but not create friction in the business environment? And I think that's a really interesting question that is brought to fore with this use case that really doesn't get discussed very frequently.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's the big reason that, and I talk about this all the time with folks that are discussing programs like this and training and what proactive measures you can do to prepare your people for situations like this. Security awareness training is not a throwaway or something that can just be canned anymore. It really needs to, Kirsten, to your point, be aligned with the role of the individual, the access that they have, the business mission, and what they're measured on. All of those things are critical and important for sure.
Yeah, Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in there, but I was also going to compliment on top of that and say the awareness training or the check the box training that some companies are doing, and I'm not slapping anyone for saying that they're doing a check the box, but when you look at business critical, right? A lot of companies now are meeting with their finance team and their HR team to go around scenarios when you were talking about, business email compromise and fraud, right? The entire company needs to understand the risk of clicking on, a phishing email, et cetera. But the finance team is going through additional training and countermeasures that when this comes through, what do we do first, right? Somebody asked to change the routing instructions for this. It's someone that I communicate with on a regular basis. I don't see any reason why this is wrong. How do we go about and check that? So they're putting additional checks and controls in place. But what does that do? That also slows down business and how business is done, right? Because there's additional checks being put in place. So regardless if it's product or training, there's things that get put in place in process that are going to add more friction, but that friction's put in place to protect the company. And that's something that comes from the top down, right? That when bought in and understood of what the risk is, it's cyber risk, but when these type of things come in, it's also process risk. Like what things have we put in place friction wise to make sure we prevent this happening? And then to this point on the MGM side, right? Like what are we doing to ensure that the people, even at the help desk side, then they're not in the finance or the HR side dealing with invoice fraud, right? But dealing with the day-to-day problems that arise. And I'll be the first to say, before I ever joined cybersecurity and I was on the business side traveling the world, if something happened to my computer and I was told call the help desk, I was calling saying, I need this fixed now. I'm out here, I'm over in this country. This has to be done immediately. And they're like, trying to get it done, right? There's a reason why some of that friction gets put in place. And if that Brian from back then doesn't understand that why, then I'm not going to understand the need for it. So I'm going to continuously push. And that's where that, not just awareness training, but that understanding of how it aligns to the business.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think when you start to think about that from a security or risk discipline perspective, one of the ways that frequently shows up or should show up in conversations at the executive team level is anytime you're talking about what our key risks are, what are the threats and risks that are going to or are likely to lead to those outcomes, and how do we, what meaningful measures do we put, Brian, to your point, to make sure that behavior or the behaviors, and whether that's a specific ticket type or request type, or specific types of access or requests for access, times of day, there's a lot of data to be looked at and monitored inside of all of those things. But that's where you start to get, I think, a really meaningful discussion between risk leaders and operational and other executive members of executive teams and boards, and start to help them paint the picture of, okay, these are the departments the business has, these are the dependencies and technical needs each of those departments have. What are the operational risks involved there? Where are the opportunities for us to get hurt, and build backwards from there, and make sure those conversations are also integrated with things like your incident response plan, the escalation process for getting in touch with legal resources, and just really having that not be each one of those things be an island, but make it a part of the headspace of the entire executive team and all those underlying operations leaders that are far removed from risk and security conversations under normal circumstances.
Yeah, and I just interject too. I think to echo kind of Brian's point, when he mentioned kind of like his past life. I mean, I think that's, really important to look at as we move from, like what I might think of as like kind of traditional person to person business, right? As you add e-signature and remote staff and, any of these new elements that make things more streamlined and more efficient, I think just taking a really deep dive and a look into, by not having that, in-person interaction, like how many more opportunities of, risk, and exposure have you created? And I think that's kind of the underlying issue with all of this. And particular to this with MGM, I think you have just a situation where obviously the staff itself, to your point, Stephen, a security awareness training, I think everybody, within the staff needs to understand like a case study like this and how severe that can possibly be. And then they might take it a little bit more serious going forward. I think it's just, everyone's so excited to see things more streamlined and moving so quickly that, they quickly forget, you know, what happens if you're not in an in-person meeting, right? Like there's drastic changes, and certainly with all the advances in AI, that's only going to get more and more in depth. I mean, and probably incredible over the next few years.
I would like to ask Stephen, though, about the question of network segmentation, because it doesn't really seem like, from at least to the perspective of where we sit, I mean, we look at the social engineering element of it, but good heavens, they were able to move quickly across the environment. And certainly in our many discussions around defense in depth, I think also this highlights very closely that things like network segmentation really need to be reviewed.
Well, network segmentation and really network segmentation as a part of a greater zero trust strategy from an architecture and security perspective. You have to assume individual controls will fail. And Brian, I know you have this conversation all the time with folks that you advise on these fronts, but if you're banking on even a small subset of products that aren't necessarily zippered up in a way that they complement one another or create noise when threat actors come up against the edges or uncovered extremities of those tools, that's when strategies like zero trust and network segmentation adopted across the board really reduce the blast radius of what is possible to happen under those kind of heightened circumstances. Because if they had some secondary controls like that in place on the MGM side, it may have been a very different outcome. We might not have even heard anything in the news about it. So, looking at that from a database and research-based perspective, that's that's something that we see a lot play out, and that's why those types of technologies are a critical part, in our opinion, of any responder's toolkit that's helping out with those types of issues.
So one thing,
Totally echo that sentiment. Sorry, on the micro segmentation, I could go down several rabbit holes, even bringing in automotive analogies in terms of one piece flow, but why certain parts that have real critical tolerances on them, right, are removed and segmented from the final assembly line and go through a DFEMA and PFEMA process for process failure mode analysis. Why not apply the same logic then into the processes that are used in business, right? What are the real critical keys to the kingdom and what are the processes for people to get to those, right? And then you put in risk controls around that, the same reason you do in production, because at the end of the day, your business is creating this finished good part. At the end of the day, your business over here was making sure you have X number of consumers coming in and out of your locations, keeping everyone happy. But how do we control that? So anyhow, before I go too automotive into everyone.
I think network segmentation is definitely a good one. One thing I'll call out is that part of the MGM breach was the fact that IT just started shutting down systems as part of their incident response plan. So it wasn't that the attackers got to like all the hotel room keys, or I think MGM even came out and said they didn't even get to the slots. That was more like IT shutting down everything. Which is, I don't know if that's like a great incident response plan, but especially if ransomware is starting to get deployed, that is kind of one of our first steps is contain everything, right? Just to identify where they're actually at. But so I don't know if they got as far as they did. Some of that was IT shutting it down. But one of the things I do want to kind of get back to, and this is a key onto our next topic with the Okta hack is. It seems within IT administrators, right? This was that they went after some sort of IT administrator type of account, and I think there definitely needs to be some better controls around who's actually resetting this. And I actually recently even heard about, and I feel like social engineering is just making a comeback at this point, right? I have phished a CISA before in my own internal company. Now it was a little bit more elaborate. But I was able to get him to click. I've gotten the 50% of the security team to click on it using food as a fish, as a lure to get them to click on stuff. So everyone's phishable. I will tell you, I've clicked on my own phishing email that I approved for my team because it was just so long. It was a busy time. I fell for it. But getting back to social engineering and calling into a help desk, the Okta. There was an Okta recently came out with it, and I feel like this has been Okta just having incident after incident, right? That there's been a couple other ones. There's been one last year, but in this case, someone called and breached the customer support system. Initially, they thought it was 1%. At the end of November, they came back and said every customer, not federal users, because they were on a different system, but every other customer had their information stolen, name and email address. That doesn't seem like a lot, but going back to tying the phishing back in, a lot of those Okta users are going to be IT administrators, and that's I feel like the world has definitely gone identity, right? Identity is huge right now because if you get access to an environment, then you and especially IT administrator, you have a lot of power within that environment.
And this is particularly challenging when one of the things, obviously, on the insurance side that is an absolute requirement is MFA, right? And so when we start looking at privileged access management, identity and access management, and the recommendation to use those controls, and yet you have an organization that's being breached, I think about this a lot, and I just shudder because I'm like, well, how do we even help our insured constituency manage their own challenges when these are the types of issues being faced by these organizations that are providing those services?
Yeah, no, and that's going back to the security awareness use case. I mean, those are the types of considerations that you would make as a part of the processes and procedure that you put in place, Brian, to your point, to manage those risks and establish those controls. Privileged access, both in the Okta breach as well as in the MGM breach and a litany of others, really would have, at a minimum, raised the privilege escalation far sooner and enabled responders to react faster and contain more of what was going on. And it quickly becomes a conversation on the cyber insurance side where, well, why are we not focusing more on this from an underwriting perspective? And why are we not focusing on identity within the security frameworks, which often I think, while they are great, well-intentioned, and academically extremely sound, no matter how you slice it, I think what's often missing from security awareness, or not security awareness, but security frameworks in general, and control architectures is, that practical last mile. Like how to, okay, so we've implemented all these controls, we have all these things we're measuring, on the risk side of things and within the security team, this is all crystal clear. But now how do we take that and translate it into those policy and procedure changes and the business facing side of that conversation? And in the case of Okta, the presence of those things could have prevented this from ever escalating to the way that it did. And that, I think, is, Brian, to the point, many of the points you made, and Kirsten, that you made, kind of the heart of the matter. And no one is really talking about it that way, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I go back to I'm going to refer to naze, the Japanese term for ask why 5 times and get to the root cause.
Mm-hmm.
And when they talked about Okta, they blamed that on an employee who saved his credentials for a server account in I think it was his personal Google account, right?
Hmm.
I'm not going to assume how that was saved there, right? Whether it was saved in the browser, whether he just saved it somewhere, right? And I'm not going to sit here and say that, well, if you would have had a password manager, right, then that solves all problems. We've seen what's happened with LastPass and a few others, but that's why those companies become targets, is because those are additional keys to the kingdom, right? And if you're one of the people that work for the company that carries keys to the kingdom from an identity side, and you're storing your credentials somewhere where you shouldn't be storing them, that's what people are looking for, is keys to get into your kingdom, to get into other people's kingdoms. So when you ask, what was the root cause? Because I'm sure and I've seen it, a million companies that have come out with, this is how we would have solved that. This is how we would have done that. Yeah, but those are all over here on the right side, right? After the fact, you would have seen this or stopped that. But that root cause of that person, right, and his credentials and his Google account being compromised, and they found it, and then they used it, and then they got in, and then from there it escalated. I also look at this too as, how can you come out and say, well, it only affected 1%, and then come out several weeks later and say, we were off. It was 97. Sorry, I looked at the wrong number, or 99%. The 1% was, it didn't happen. The 99% was, it did. I also looked at, there was a little bit of a lack of transparency there for a few weeks. And I've seen that in forum chats with other peers of mine that have really talked about that. And that's where you start to lose credibility as a business.
So I was reading a Wall Street article on that recently about the fact that, could it be that these new rules in place that people have to report on a breach within an X amount of time, and those rules haven't necessarily kicked in. They're supposed to, we're getting pretty close to those rules kicking in this month, but is that going to cause even more misinformation going forward?
And I'm going to jokingly say this, it's the total opposite of a sales guy, where it's like shoot high and then come low. Now it's shoot low and gently go high, right? As you begin to discover more. I think there's a lot of truth around what you just said, that because of the timing that you have to report, a lot of times you won't have all that information readily available at that immediate time of, hey, it's due today. It's due right this minute.
Well, and that even starts to talk about what is reasonable. And from a disclosure perspective, and anyone that's spoken with Cyber Counsel or somebody who has an expertise in privacy law is going to tell you that that timetable typically doesn't start until you have firm forensic conclusions in most legal jurisdictions and regulations. That's of course not a blanket statement, but a majority of them, that's kind of when the timetable starts. And I think that's also not a well understood data point in terms of people considering the impacts of those disclosures and communications that need to happen inside of their incident response plan and program. And that's, that's something that should be arising to the executives and board level and be discussed ahead of those things happening. But frequently it's not. And I think ultimately that's what leads to these kind of, ready and fire situations like we saw with Okta and what they disclosed. And we've seen it a lot in the past too, but that's really symptomatic, I think, of a lack of continuity in that conversation across those executive teams.
Yes, absolutely.
If anyone else wants to jump in there too, feel free to add more fuel, because I was going more also on the speculation side of when we talked earlier about putting friction in place. If you have more workers working from home, and this is an assumption, so I hate to even use it, but now imagine that you work for a tech company and you can work from wherever it is you want, right? Not that's a blanket statement. But if said individual is working remotely and traveling here, traveling there, sometimes doesn't have access and says, okay, I'm going to put my credentials here in this account so I have access to it because that's what I need to do my job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it comes down to that awareness training and that process failure mode analysis for the people that work for your company who have access to those infrastructure that you guys support for all of your clients, right? So just putting a control in place that is a blanket statement that thou shall not do this. How do you control that, right? So I think there's definitely some conversations that have probably gone on behind closed doors there for Okta and how that was handled.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what really starts to become interesting about that is the fact that so many, like, if anyone who has done this type of consulting work with any number of businesses ranging from small to very large knows that that is a common industry-wide problem right now, right? Like no one outside of, I would say, the exceptions that are out there is really tackling that in a concrete and consistent, well thought out way. And I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of the tension that exists between security teams and business teams kind of broadly and has culturally for a long time because of the nature of the relationship between those two organizations within any business. And that even is kind of further compounded by, the situations or kind of scapegoating type of behavior that we've seen from some executive teams relative to their CISOs. They're not necessarily working as a team to resolve and set the stage for those circumstances to be successful when that stuff does happen, Brian, to your point. And very often it becomes combative or, a finger pointing exercise. And that ultimately doesn't protect the organization any better. And it certainly doesn't protect the third parties for whom that organization maintains any kind of sensitive or critical data.
Yeah, I think you're going to constantly have that. I mean, it's just in any business, the nature of like regulating the business and the compliance aspect of the business is always going to be almost directly combating, the profitability and the marketability and, the fluidity of that business's operations, right? So you're just going to continually have that battle back and forth. And I think a big part of the problem, with something like this, I mean, obviously, clearly that awareness continues to be a serious issue there, but also even in that disclosure and that reporting, Okta probably has people in place that understand all of this, but you got to take businesses and other industries and other verticals that the person completing these reports or going through these compliance exercises may have no understanding of technology and IT and cybersecurity. And I mean, what does that lead to as far as like the accuracy of that reporting and disclosure going forward? So again, I think it's just a matter of, as you said, like those teams really need to come together and, maybe for the first time in some of these other industries, bring the compliance and the security folks, on board with the business development team and, put these processes in place. Because there's only, so many industries that already have that kind of compliance structure in place. And again, I think it's going to have to be, widespread for everybody at some point. So.
I completely agree.
So I feel like there's a topic here that as far as, because I feel like we've talked about friction between different groups, and to me it's also almost like a user experience type of thing. And I feel like nowadays we have this initiative to get rid of passwords. So I don't know what people's thoughts about getting rid of passwords and going to something more like a hardware token, FIDO and all that kind of technology that I think is getting a lot more mature, and to me is a viable option and solves a lot of these problems. Now it creates new problems, but I wonder what your all's thought on that is.
I mean, my dad's not working anymore, but I can't even get him to use a password manager. But the amount of time it took people to start recognizing the value in a password manager, and then you start to get them onboarded on that. I see a ton of value right out the gate in a password manager. But I do agree where you were going with that statement. I'd be interested to hear everybody else's commentary on FIDO. This is another one of those chat forum discussions that you get a lot of great feedback on from practitioners and where they see it going. You know, even Microsoft's been working behind the scenes on passwordless, and there are a lot of importance behind it. And I think part of it is getting people at the executive level to trust it, right? And with that, it needs to be explained to them in layman's terms. And I think that's the starting point.
I think they're very viable solutions. But I mean, if you remember like our RSA tokens that we used to use and those types of things, and oh my gosh, I left mine at home, or it's like there's always this continual thing about trying to put those things in place. The thing that I hear the most from practitioners, though, is that it's the executives who are their biggest offenders when it comes to things like MFA or those, and it's terrible. And they're like, just turn off MFA for me, but make everybody else use it. And it's like, but you're the one who's the most targeted. No, it has to be the other way around. And so it is a big thing that, this need for organizations to take security seriously as part of their business mission, kind of back to our other discussion, because I think partly people will do what's asked of them. And as we were discussing earlier, part of it is explain to them the implications of not, and not feeling like it's just such a pain, right? And I actually like MFA because it makes me feel like, oh, I'm doing good things, right? And so I think but also I understand why. And I think that the big part of it is getting the executive suite to understand why it is so critical and how they're the leaders in all senses of leading their organizations to take these things seriously, and why it is critical to their business mission to do so.
I couldn't agree more, and I think there's a couple opportunities for advancement and progress on as an outcome of those discussions. And I think it's that it draws back to the theme of security is not a one size fits all conversation. It's not even that within the same organization at different levels of the organization, you're not going to use the same controls and risk mitigation measures for executives that you would use for IT admins or developers, because they just fundamentally have different levels of access. There's a different level of risk, and there's a different not only mindset but operational impact to those things. And so from an insurance perspective, what I think is interesting, and I believe this is why policies on executives and especially CISOs we've seen kind of evolving over the last 12 months as a result of this, because I think what's going to end up happening on the insurance side of that is one, those top officers and key officers within even the technology or security teams may need different forms of coverage that augment existing like cyber policies or other things that would cover these specific use cases. But coming back down to protecting individual liability and individual legal or regulatory impact on some of those practitioners, and I think there'll be a bifurcation of those things over time. What I think is interesting about that is, it really puts a higher emphasis to the points that you all made kind of through this segment of the discussion. Identity is such an important thing to manage, and we have some really advanced and great ways of doing it, but we have not seen unilateral adoption of all of those things, especially things like FIDO2, Tim, to your point, across organizations, because some of it is just emerging and so new, and only just now becoming viable to deploy at scale in those ways. And then kind of the final takeaway that I have from all of this, and really all the topics that we've discussed, and Tim, this may be a good segue into kind of the next topic, but I think threat modeling at the business level, and not necessarily at a deep technical level, but looking at those business outcomes, looking at the operational controls, and what the actual risk profile and attack surface of some of these, unique use cases or individuals that could be targeted. Those things become all that much more important as we start to translate this into that business conversation, and escape the conversation about technical security controls.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you brought that because I don't have a great segue into Citrix Bleed like I did in my previous one. But moving away from kind of the social engineering aspect, vulnerability management is still important. In this case, this was a particular nasty one. It reminds me of Heartbleed for anyone that had to deal with that back in 2014, where there was a buffer flow type of attack used against Citrix OpenID that pretty much caused the memory to leak more information than it really needed to. And this, was information to get into the environment. Anyone interacting with it. This impacted Citrix NetScaler ADCs and gateway appliances. If you're on their cloud services, it wasn't an issue. But if you haven't patched, by the way, go patch now, because we are seeing active exploitation. As soon as security researchers get a hold of the patch and reverse engineer it, and really, I think a lot of even ransomware games are starting to take that approach of as soon as a vulnerability is announced, trying to reverse engineer the patch to find a way in. But in this one, this was so nasty that it's pretty much just giving people access into the environment. So I don't really have a good way to anywhere particular to start, but what are you guys' thoughts on the latest? To me, the big new named vulnerability within the security space.
I think it harkens back to the comments. I forget if it was the head of the NSA, somebody higher up in one of the leadership positions from a cyber risk perspective within the U.S. government, and I think it was at DEF CON this past, or either this year or last year, that she said this. But this is the reason that software security in the SaaS space, and for whether it's Okta, Citrix, or any of these vendors that are producing security technologies or technologies that enable high availability access to many different resources, why vulnerability management and security, product security, is such an important conversation and needs to be for those folks, and why regulation around this stuff can't just be in the last mile. It has to also exist somewhere upstream, relative to those types of systemic risks, because whether you're thinking about SolarWinds, Kaseya, and any of these really large, scary SaaS breaches that have happened, or individual threats like Heartbleed or Citrix Bleed, the impact of those things is massive, and the reach that those techniques enable folks on the criminal side to have is really pervasive and economically impactful to the country. So I think my take on all of these family of vulnerabilities and just kind of the life cycle around vulnerability management and the public conversations around it is that technology vendors have to redouble their efforts to make sure their applications are secure and make sure that they're threat modeling and looking for those abuse cases. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to see, every quarter, every year, as time goes on, more and more of these vulnerabilities that weren't found by researchers early on, or prior to production implementation of these technologies, and ultimately that's just going to lead to more breaches for end customers.
On the insurance side, what's happening now is that many insurance companies are limiting the payouts for these systemic types of events, 0 days and so on. So if there's a broad level attack that moves across multiple environments at the same time, there could be exclusions. And so that's also a big component of this, is now the ability for an individual organization to control their fate as it relates to being able to get a payout if they're impacted by this can be really significantly reduced. And so these are the areas too about vulnerability management that is so critical to make sure that that's being managed. And also then, of course, broadly, that patch management is becoming a requirement of cyber insurance policies as well. So these are areas to be particularly focused on, and make sure you dust off that policy and take a read to understand what your requirements are, and whether there are questions that should be asked of vendors to make sure that there is proper care and feeding and vulnerability management of those upstream solutions so that they can pay for an incident if one occurs.
Yeah, I think proper care and feeding, but also transparency when a vulnerability is discovered. And I've seen a lot of work that CISA's put into updating the information that they release around actively exploited vulnerabilities that you see in the wild. That way you can prioritize. It'd be interesting to see, what the insurance companies do going into 24, 25, 26 around vulnerability management, right? And those vulnerabilities that are known, those vulnerabilities that have been released, say by Citrix or said company, but also going back to, from an oversight side, companies that do ship hardware or provide services, and when they're confronted with a known exploit, how soon they come out and release information around a available patch for it, especially when it becomes knowingly exploited. I think the days, going back a few years ago, where behind closed doors, some practitioners said, plausible deniability until I can get budget. I don't even want to put a solution in place to see what we have, because then we know about it, right? Now, because of cyber insurance, those requirements are there where you have to have a certain maturity level. So now we do have that, which means the business, when I say business, I consider security part of the business, which means all the stakeholders have to come to the table, and those other IT operations have to be on board with creating some type of a program around timing to put the right fixes in place based on the level of vulnerability or the level of risk associated to the business. I mean, imagine if you came across a bridge that you looked at and said, yep, the township recognizes that this bridge was struck by a large moving vehicle. The bridge itself shouldn't be driven over by X equipment, but we really can't afford to fix it for another year or two. Let's just let everyone keep driving over it. And someone drives over it and the entire bridge implodes. Heads would roll. Literally would roll. It's the same thing here, right? Like, you provide a piece of equipment to a company, and that company, if they're actively exploited and that company wasn't doing the proper patch management, et cetera, but that company housed all your social security information and everything else, and now it's out there in the wild, you should be upset. But I also think there's a little bit of naivety amongst the consumer base. We're talking to people like, well, I just assume all my information's out there now, just because that's what they read in the news, right? But no, there should be a level of responsibility there. And I think cyber insurance has helped drive some of that. And you're seeing a lot of companies on the vulnerability management side come out with, and I hate to talk to product, but better products for companies to be able to manage that better.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's why this is why application security, especially considering the importance of vulnerability management, really just becomes over time, I think it will become not only mandatory for cyber insurance policies for those organizations that are providing services or application access like that, but it's likely that's going to be the battleground where a lot of those kind of standards are implemented and maintained over the next six to 12 months, especially as we see just continue to see more zero-day vulnerabilities and things like Citrix Bleed arise in the industry.
Did any of you guys read what was the book? Not Countdown to 0 Days. That was a good one. But This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends.
No, you want to give a brief description of it?
So it's basically goes back to the very, very beginning of the 0-day trade, right? And the initial coming out and talking about discoveries. And I'm not going to shame any of the big companies here, but some of the bigger companies were very, very much against it, but that actually created the 0-day trade versus 0 days for money. But the initial reason for disclosing it was done for good reasons. But then threat actors were out there using those vulnerabilities, and some of the biggest software companies were shaming people, individuals, for going ahead and doing that. And there became a lot of back and forth. There's another book called The CDC, The Cult of the Dead Cow. In the group, I mean, they were very instrumental in doing some of the first big releases at Black Hat and how that all came about, and putting it up on stage for the world to see. And I think people would be very surprised to understand who some of the members of Cult of the Dead Cow actually are, because now they're leading government officials or in positions of power, but they weren't out there doing things initially for the purpose of bad, but the purpose of disclosure, so that these things could be fixed, because they understood what was going on in the world. And I think if people took a step back and read the entire book of This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, they'd have a much larger appreciation for how immense the cyber world is, and how these flaws, when discovered, can be used for bad, and why disclosure is so important.
Yeah, 100%. And that I think what's interesting about that is whether it's the Cult of the Dead Cow or a lot of the folks that very early into the security industry helped make those conversations happen. I think on the flip side of it, or the opposition to it, that concerns me, and then I'm happy to see that has mostly been positive recently, but I still think is going to be really the hill to die on for researchers that are doing, engaging in this type of research and helping to provide that to companies so they can make their products more secure. But the handling of those disclosures, the criminalizing of that research in some cases, and how courts are handling those cases is just going to continue to be such an important issue, both for security practitioners and the world at large that's consuming these products.
Yeah, even on the Citrix side, when you read through like some of the steps that are used, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the groups, when they looked at it, were like, yeah, these are the 4 main things that they were using, after the initial flaw when they got in. But 2 of the groups were using Mimikatz. And when you read the book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, when you understand, like, when that researcher came out to disclose Mimikatz and was basically shunned, right? And he put it out there. Finally, he's like, okay, I'm just going to present this to everybody. And then everybody freaked out overnight, right? Like, and he's like, I did everything I was asked to do. I tried it. I know people are using it. Everyone needs to see this, right? And those are some of the interesting conversations. And I think it's a really interesting book for not only practitioners, but the way it reads is pretty easy for a consumer to kind of go from beginning to end to understand how that market was created. And it does that awareness training, right? It makes you question then some of the things that you do, and then think about security in a different light.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the vulnerability disclosure space has gotten a lot better, because you see a lot of them, and even like big companies like Google are doing it, right? Project Zero, they give them 90 days and then they're releasing the details of whatever it is. And I think a lot of people, I think that's a good standard to have. Now, I think if you're working with the company and they're like asking for more time, there's, some back and forth. And so I think that's gotten better, because to your point, back in the early days of 0 days, people were getting sued, not just shamed, but they were getting sued by lawyers, legal teams trying to come after them. It was pretty nasty. And that's what creates that black market. It's like, well, if I'm, can't do anything here, right? It potentially could end up, someone could get disgruntled, especially if a lawyer's coming after them, they got to pay for lawyer fees. They're going to go over, okay, who one of the bad guys wants this? Because they can kind of wash their hands of it. They're not using it. They're just selling a technique that's kind of out there. But and kind of the other view of that, though, too, it is, and we're talking about application security, there are a lot more vulnerabilities. The CVE is expanded from, the 4 last digits to, what is it, like 6 now? So there's a lot more vulnerability disclosure. And like, how do you prioritize a lot of that different stuff? That's the new challenge. And people can come and go to a company and say, hey, this is an issue. But they're also dealing with all the little issues that people are like, hey, this is an issue. And when you look at it, because I've been on the other side of that, where I've gotten a report, it was like, this is not really that big of an issue. Like, it's, it's like a little thing on a website somewhere. And even, asset inventory management of what's actually on your website, right? The healthcare industry got in trouble last year for having Google Analytics on their login portals for health, for people logging for health stuff. So I think it's definitely an interesting problem. I think we will continue to see it, but hopefully we're getting better on it. So again, I don't have a great transition to this one, but this is kind of our fun, happy story because RagnarLocker was taken down by law enforcement. I'm going to let Steven kick this one off after I kind of explain some of the nuances to this one, but we actually had a good experience with this as part of an engagement. But RagnarLocker, this was a combined effort between multiple organizations with Europol, U.S. Law enforcement companies, and judicial authorities. They were able to get the developer of the RagnarLocker in Paris. They also interviewed 5 others. I also did see, because if they're going to interview a developer, he probably has connections to other parts of the ransomware gang underworld. A Hive member was recently caught as well too, and was being and I think they were. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It was on a newsletter I read pretty regularly, but and it was on like a French website, so I had to do the Google Translate. But it was the person that handles the money, which to me is kind of big, and that's to me a big, huge win for law enforcement. So, Stephen, I'll let you kind of go on it as far as our experience, though.
Yeah, no, so in this case, it was really interesting. We had the pleasure of helping a client that was actually hit by RagnarLocker ahead of the takedown, and then through the few weeks of work to secure, get them back online, we started to see things like the web presence for RagnarLocker go dark. Their customer communication and support portal died. A few days later, we started to see their command and control nodes start to be taken down and no longer connect. Stop responding to a lot of the tests or other looks that we were doing into those things. And so over the course of a few weeks, we got to visually see this play out, and then maybe a week after that was when the first news article started to drop about the takedown, and it was very exciting and a wonderful thing to be able to tell the client that was involved, that this criminal group who had previously hurt them, that was positioning these demands and it had encrypted a large portion of their environment, was now out of commission. And not that there was no risk, because of course there's rebranding or folks that weren't caught that can go and start things back up at a future time, but that key individuals and systems within the RagnarLocker backyard were definitely seized and taken down by law enforcement. And so that was not something that happens very often, but it was a really, really fun conversation to have with that client. So this news story and activity in particular is really interesting to us for that reason.
It's like they say, follow the money.
Yeah.
Follow the money. Sorry, I think you were about to say something. I didn't want to interrupt there.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, I think this type of action is much more needed, especially with the way that crime is kind of evolving. Ransomware still being a strong trend in the industry, but criminals kind of diversifying how they're approaching exploitation of victims. And it's always good to see wins in the law enforcement front, because there was a time where there really wasn't a lot of that, and law enforcement was very unsuccessful at unseating a lot of these even very large ransomware gangs that were causing a lot of damage and creating a lot of financial distress in the industries they were affecting.
Well, I think to that point too, it becomes because getting online and going to websites and doing stuff, they say never hack stuff, but you actually have to get caught. The more these ransomware gangs get caught, the less lucrative it is for them. And really, a lot of people are trying to do the right thing, but it's paying out so much at this point that a lot of people, it can draw them in, even if they're good people and they have just crappy life situations, right? And they can't get a job and they can't pay the bills, they've got medical expenses, things like that. And so hopefully, to your point, if law enforcement gets more involved and starts making this, more risky of an endeavor for people, they're going to, try to actually go get a legitimate job instead of, ending up behind bars. But, the underground is also flush with, pictures of cars and money and all this other stuff that it is an enticing draw.
We are seeing more activity though, and able to enforce more frequently. And so like we have seen some of those actors when they've gone abroad, we with Interpol have been able to get them. The challenge is that we just had one not long ago where the actor was let go after 18 months. And so that was that, right? And so the question on the law enforcement side is, well, how long should, that's like a policy question that I don't have the answer to, but how long should these people be forced to be incarcerated, and does it help, right? Because I don't know that I don't have numbers on recidivism rates, but I'm guessing for hackers it's decently high, right? You have to have like a little tag on your machine or something. I don't know, but these are things that we are getting better, more sophisticated, and able to reach, because the biggest challenge, to the point of everyone here, is the ability to reach in and actually prosecute and get results of that prosecution. We have all these standing warrants for organizations and people within those organizations. To just track them and find them and arrest them, that's a big challenge, but it's happening more frequently than it ever has.
One thing I put out there when I was talking with Stephen about this topic, a few days ago, I love this story. I thought it was great. I go, but this was only feasible because of the location of where these threat actors were.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on the geo of where they're located, and this is why, and we talked about this too, Stephen, at the start of the Ukraine war, you saw ransomware just plummet, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's definite reasons why that would happen because of where some of these threat actors were located in both the Ukraine and Russia, and they got conscripted. But even outside of that, there's another great book that I'm going to throw out there called The Cuckoo's Egg. And this one's great for every listener that's not cyber focused, but it reads like a James Bond film. But this goes back to the early 1980s. And you look at when they got law enforcement involved, when this astronomer discovered a discrepancy of a few pennies at a university, strictly because at a university, if you're using this giant telescope and people have access to it, it's all based on funding that you get. And that funding, every penny has to be accounted for. And there's a few cents off. And it turned out someone was calling in from Europe. But that person was a professor. Turns out that professor was on sabbatical, so someone was using his account. And when he called the FBI, because he found that, and I won't give away the whole story, but he found that this person that was navigating in here was then moving over to different military installations and searching for weird code words that he didn't know what they were. But when he told the government, they're like, oh, that's a secret missile program. That's this, right? But the FBI said, well, what's the financial impact? He goes, 3.5 cents. And they were like, call someone who cares. Click. Why? Because the impact to him was 3.5 cents. But what were they getting, right? And this goes into a much broader conversation because everyone talks about ransomware. But there's a reason why China becomes such a big focus in conversation, because the different threat actors in all different parts of the geo, some are focused strictly on ransomware or business email compromise to get quick payment. Others are very focused on your data, right? And your intellectual property, because those advancements will pay off 10 years down the road. And it took, in the Cuckoo's Egg, years to explain to certain government agency why this was such a big impact, right? And even then to track it down, and that's the cool part, so I won't give that away. But that's really what I see as like, this was a great example of a takedown. But some of the better stories that I've seen come out, right, where someone was trying to steal, I think it was the Pepsi Cola, trade secret of how to line the aluminum can, right, and why that would be so important. It doesn't sound that big, like it's a coating on an aluminum can, but what is that actually worth, right, competitive-wise in the market, right? And those are the things that people are going after. And I saw that in 16 years of automotive, right? Like when you're working on projects that are 5 years out, right? And we were working on, advanced detection systems, not on the cyber side, but on driverless vehicles. right? And what we were doing at that stage, even 7-10 years ago, right? Why that was so valuable, because it takes 10 years of doing the research to be able to develop a product to bring to market, right? So I throw that out there because, one, the book's great. Two, this was a great story, but it really is focused on money, follow the money. But then there's the second part of that is follow the technology, and why that's important.
Well, and it's particularly important because there's the other element of this, which is motivation and intent. And we often hear, especially smaller organizations, say, "Oh, I don't need to do fill in the blank thing. I don't need security. I don't need insurance. I don't need whatever, because I don't have anything that anybody wants." And I try to remind those people, you do not get to be the judge of that. You do not know the motivation and intent of the adversary. And so therefore, those types of scenarios are very difficult to determine. And it's not up to you to determine what's valuable to them. And in fact, you're probably going to be wrong anyway. Even if you had $10 million sitting on your desk, you still could be wrong entirely. So it's a great example. And so it's a really good point, because ultimately we can reverse engineer that to follow the money. And especially in criminal gangs, it's a much easier scenario when we're talking about nation state motivations. All bets are off, because it's very difficult to go backwards. And you're right, it's not about money very often. So that's what makes our world more interesting than many others, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think those not only are those other motivation, like non-financial motivations, difficult to quantify, but it's not like threat actors are going to leave that in the note when they're hitting you, right? If they have those intentions, those state actors are not going to make it easy for you to understand what they're targeting forensically or otherwise. And it is great that we're making progress on the ransomware front and with a lot of the criminal groups that are financially motivated. But to your point, Brian and Kirsten, I think countries that don't extradite or that will not comply with law enforcement around the globe to help address those things are only going to embolden and position those geographic locations as jumping off points for threat actors that are in the market to get funding from different state and federal agencies of different military and intelligence organizations around the world. Are they going to be on their payroll? No, but the money is going to flow through them and be connected to them in a way that they're going to be able to influence the priorities, motivations, and targets of their victims. And in so doing, also obfuscate what it is they're after. A great example I could raise is years ago we did a case for a manufacturing company here in the States that was targeted by the Conti ransomware gang based out of St. Petersburg, if folks are familiar with them. And the primary reason for the attack seemed to be the theft of some specific trade secrets and disruption of some of their manufacturing activities. And a lot of that correlated with some geopolitical events that were happening at that time. This was in 2021. And, it was really interesting to see how much more involved and aware three-letter agencies were in interpreting and I guess building backwards the story of what happened there and using that to help aid in their search for some of those details. Because in previous years, that those were conversations we were never experiencing, or not very often, with law enforcement. Frequently, Brian, it would play out the way that you suggested. You call the FBI or whatever law enforcement agency might be involved or have jurisdiction over what's going on, and their first and central question is always financial impact, when that's not necessarily in some of those cases of intellectual property or other forms of crime that are still very pervasive and happening even today at a greater rate. Those are just didn't seem to be on their radar. So it is good to see that things are shifting in that direction, but I do think it's going to continue to be a complicated and challenging box to unpack for law enforcement.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I was going to add there too, since I brought up the cuckoo's egg, Stephen, the name of the book, if those that are familiar with the cuckoo bird, right? It lays an egg in another bird's nest and allows it to hatch so that other bird takes care of its baby, feeds its baby, etc. And the name of the book came from the fact that every day that he booted the person out, the next day it hatched again. And it just kept happening and happening and happening. And I thought it was a really cool take as an example. One, I had no idea what a cuckoo bird was, but understanding the cuckoo's egg, right? And the idea of planting something that hatches and your system takes care of it every day and feeds it, right? Is a really good example. But you're right. The 5 cents to them was what's the problem? What's the biggest problem? And at the time, if you go back to the early 1980s, there wasn't a good understanding of how the internet was being used, right? It was this open tool for these universities to be able to communicate and share knowledge rather quickly. That's definitely evolved, and we've seen that, especially as far as we've gotten today and the rise of AI. So I think there's a good understanding of it now and why some of the rules and regulations have come down. And it will be really interesting to see how some of the prosecution takes place in the future for crimes that don't necessarily have a dollar figure planted on it in terms of this is what it cost us today, but what it could cost us tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think kind of, an understanding of what that data is worth, and what that actual, business system itself might be worth. First off, I mean, would lend to the, businesses maybe taking it a little bit more serious to put some, proactive and preventative measures in place. But also to your point, where does that lead from kind of that prosecution standpoint, or, even how does that fuel what, lack of a better word, what the bad guys might do? Because take somebody breaking into your house, for instance, they might not even know what they're looking for, but once they get in there, right, they might find something and determine, well, this data or this asset could be worth a lot. Let's do the outreach and find out who's the highest bidder, right? So I think it's, really have to have a deeper understanding of that, because the end game might be very different, for the people on the other side, one way or the other.
Yeah, no, and I think an interesting anecdote I can share that's a great example of that is, we're in the past we've worked in multiple industries that have a high volume of personally identifiable information and lots of things that are traditionally considered a target for criminals and are in fact a target for criminals. But what was interesting about the situation that I'm going to describe is that the organization that was targeted, when they were completely compromised with ransomware, the gang in question encrypted every asset they had, all their data, everything. But at the end of the day, their insurance and other kind of measures, risk management measures they had in place for the students and for employees of the organization really adequately addressed some of those risks. And there were, of course, disclosures that had to happen, but that's all kind of to be expected under those circumstances. But what was troubling to them and what actually compelled them to pay a ransom was not any of that. It was this kind of dirty laundry repository of unresolved legal situations or issues with staff or issues with other folks that became the subject of extortion between the criminal and the victim. And so, to your point, Brian, I think we're going to see more of that as criminals get smarter about the real value of those things. And we've already seen this type of exploitation happen, in the last 2-3 years here. So I have to believe it's only going to be a trend that continues to rise upward and becomes more common.
Yeah, to that point, there was a ransomware gang. I don't have the details right in front of me, so I'm not going to name it out, but they put in the SEC filing against the company that they ransomware.
Yeah.
So
I was going to mention that.
yeah, that is to me interesting. But to your point, Stephen, like the ransomware gangs are always looking for new ways to get pretty much the company in trouble, especially if they're not planning to pay.
Yep. Yes, indeed. I think it's a fascinating thing to keep an eye on, and I think it'll only the most interesting stuff is yet to come. I think we're only seeing kind of the beginnings of it in the last couple of years here.
All right, I think that's a good point to wrap up there. Any other last remaining thoughts, ideas floating around in their head?
No, it was very comprehensive. Thank you for including me in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for coming.
I appreciate it. It was great to meet everybody. Kirsten, Matt, great to meet you guys. Timothy, thank you for leading it.
Yeah, all of you as well. Thanks again.
All
All
right.
right. I think that's a wrap. Unless, Steven, you got some final words.
No, my only final words are get a cyber insurance policy, have an incident response plan, and talk with advisors if you don't have them, because this stuff is not going away. It's only going to get more important as time goes on.
You are now the Bob Barker of cyber insurance.
That's right.